Good afternoon. My name is Bill Kuehler, and I am the host of our Friday edition of Military Trailblazer Office Hours. I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us today, especially those of you who are joining us for the first time. The primary mission of Military Trailblazer Office Hours is to provide a live forum for transitioning military, veterans, their spouses, and allies to ask questions and get help on their Salesforce learning journey. Besides answering questions and providing help where we can, we also invite industry leaders, Salesforce MVPs, ISV partners, and others to speak and provide insight into various parts of the Salesforce platform and ecosystem. So before we open things up to your questions, there's one topic that we're going to cover today, and that is session-based permission sets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through just a quick example of session-based permission sets so you can see what that functionality is and how that works. So I'm going to share my screen. And you can see here that I am actually in the sandbox environment for my production Salesforce. So the use case that we're going to look at today is where you have some object, some fields, some piece of functionality in Salesforce that you want a user to have access to, but you don't want them to have access to it all the time, right? So we just want to make it so that when they need it, they can get access to it, but otherwise it's locked down, they can't see it. So what I did prior to the call here is I created a custom object called secret object. And you can see that I have it here as a related list on the account. So what we want to have happen here is that for particular users, we want them to be able to see this object or have access to this object, but only when they explicitly say, hey, I need access to it right now. So session-based permission sets are what's going to allow us to do that. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into setup here. I'm going to actually move you all out of the way. So I'm going to move into setup, and you'll see that just to grant access to that object in general, I created a permission set. So from setup, I'm going to search for permission sets, and you'll see that I created one called, if I can get my little Rolodex thing here, we have a permission set called secret object access. Okay, and if I click into this, there's nothing magical about this, right? It's just a standard permission set that when we look at our object settings here, and we scroll all the way down to the S for our objects, you can see that I've granted access to this secret object. And if I click into that object, you can see that I've granted access to all the related fields for that object as well. Okay, assuming the page renders. Here we go. Okay, so you can see that we have access to the object and access to all the related fields. Now, when it comes to making this session-based, what we would do is we actually go into the properties of the permission set itself. And you'll see this setting here that says session activation required. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and check this, and I'm going to click save. And what that should do, this should make it available for session activation and deactivations. And I also want to now assign this permission set to any users that I want to have access to this object based on their session. So if I click on manage assignments, I'm just going to confirm that I have access, my logged in user, and you can see that here. Now, because we just made this a session-based permission set, in theory now, if I go back to my account record here and I refresh, my expectation is that that object is going to disappear. Access to the object will be removed. Now, I might be surprised here because, okay, there we go. So it has been removed. I was going to say maybe if, I had already had access and then just turned on that setting, maybe it would be different. But you can see I no longer have access to that object, even though I'm in that permission set. So with session-based permission sets, we actually have to give some kind of mechanism to turn it on for this current session, this current logged in session that I have with Salesforce. So the one way in which we can do that is actually through flow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to our flows, and I'm going to create a screen-based flow. All right, so I'm going to go to new flow, and we're going to create a new flow called, well, let's see, screen-based flow. And I'm going to have just a single step. Now, keep in mind, we can add all kinds of decision blocks and different screens, and you can ask users questions and then based on their answers, provide access. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to have a single screen on here that is going to say something like, let's see, let's label this thing first. So do you need access? Okay, and then I'm going to throw in a display text here that says, we'll call this do you need access message, okay? And in the message I'm going to display to the user is, do you really need access to this thing, or access to the secret? No, it's not even close. Secret object. Okay. And then on my little screen, I'm just going to give them one option. Again, we're going to keep this super simple. We're not going to have a previous button. We're not going to have a pause button, but we are going to have a next or finish button. And we're even going to, we're going to say a custom label here, and we're going to say, yes, I really need all the access. Okay, something corny like that, right? So again, all they're going to be presented with is a screen that says, do you really need access to this object? They're going to click a button, and then we're going to grant access. Now, the way that we grant access, or the way that we turn on the session-based permission set, is by using a standard action that Salesforce gives us. And if you just go to the new action step here, and we type in session, you'll see there's two of them here. One is for activate the session-based permission set, and one to deactivate it. Okay, so again, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to go with activation, and we'll give this an appropriate label and name. So grant access to the secret object. Cool kids never put anything in the description. So you really should put something in the description for later. But in any case, the permission set now, they're going to ask us, well, what permission set do you want to grant access to? So what this is actually the API name of that permission-based or session-based permission set that we created. So if I go to permission sets, I should have copied this earlier, but if I go to permission sets and then go to the S, we want to go to our secret object access, and we're going to grab the API name here. So that's this right here. So I probably could have guessed that, but in any case, we'll paste that there. We'll click done. Okay, now I'm going to save this, and we're going to call this, grant access to secret object flow. All right, and then save that. All right, so now we have the screen flow, right? And I better activate this before I forget. So we have a screen flow, but we have to put it somewhere. We have to give the user access to actually see the screen, right? So again, there's a couple ways you could do this, and based on the use case, you might choose one or the other. But just for now, just to keep the use case simple, I'm actually going to create just a Lightning app page. So if we go to our Lightning app builder, I'm going to create a new Lightning app. And on this Lightning app page, we're going to make this an app page. We'll call this secret object request, right? So that's just a label for our page. And then we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to make it a single screen. We're not going to have columns. We're not going to have headers and everything else. It's just going to be a single page. And again, hopefully at some point in me rambling, the screen will actually render, and I'll be able to select that single page any second now. Okay, there we go. So we're just going to select one region and finish. Okay, so now we have just a basic page, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag our flow onto this page. All right, and we just got to make sure that we have selected the correct flow. So in this case, it's going to be, where did I create that? Grant access to secret flow. Again, one column, no big deal. Click save. We're going to activate this now, and I'm going to assign it to whatever app that I'm in. What app am I in? RHA console. Okay, so if I jump over to our Lightning experience, I'll add this to RHA console and save. Okay, so again, just to recap real quick, we have a custom object called secret object. We're relating it to the account object. We want it to display there as a related list, but we only want it to be activated, or we only want users to be able to see it when they explicitly request during that session to have access to it. So we turned our permission set that granted access to that object into a session-based permission set. We created a flow with a screen on it, and we're displaying that flow on a page that basically says, do you really need access to this? And when they click yes, it's going to grant them that session-based permission set. So now that I've saved this, in theory, we should be able to go back here. I'll refresh my screen. You can confirm again that on this account, we don't currently have access to that secret object. assuming it renders. There we go. Okay, so we don't have access to it yet. But if I were to go to our app launcher here, or go into our app, I have this secret object request page that I just created. So if I click on this now, it's going to take me to this. It's going to say, do you really need access to this secret object? I'm going to say, yes, I really need all the access. Okay, and that's it, right? Again, we kept that flow super simple, just a single button. But now if I go back to my account and I refresh this now, what I would expect is that I've now enabled these permissions for this current session that I'm in, and it should be available again. So when I look at our related list, I should see that secret object, and there you go. Now, again, the way this works is when I log out or my session expires, the next time I log in, I'm no longer going to see that object until I request it again. So when you think about how you can expand this, you might have, maybe it's, private, performance review information or something like that, while you want the manager to be able to see it, maybe they share their screen a lot, or they're working with others, where they can see their screen or something, and you want to make it so that under normal circumstances they're not seeing that information, but they can explicitly request it, and then when they're done, they can even request to turn it off on that same screen. So again, very quick walkthrough of session-based permission sets, but it's something that you can think about some pretty creative ways you might leverage this kind of functionality. So let me stop my share, and I'll open it up for questions on this, and then assuming no questions on this, we'll jump into the topics. But any questions on session-based permission sets? And if you haven't done so, you can feel free to come off mute or raise your hand, whatever works. Okay, so we'll pause then for questions. And there's one other topic that I want to go into before we open up for general questions. And this was something that had come from the community, and it was around how would you, if you built this out in a sandbox, how do you deploy this to production, right? And one of the mechanisms that we can use to deploy changes like this to production would be change sets. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back in the setup here, and I'm going to try to package all these things that we did up into a change set and then deploy this to production, or pretend I'm going to deploy it to production. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to setup, go to quick find, and we're going to look at change sets. And in this case, since we're going from a sandbox to production, these would be outbound change sets. All right. So I'm going to go and create a new one. And I'm going to call this secret object changes v1. Give it an appropriate description. And then when you save this, you're presented with this screen where now you can select, okay, what is it that you want to be a part of this change set? So under change set components, what we can do is we can click add. And from this screen, we can select what type of stuff do we want to add. In this case, let's start out simple. Let's go to the object that we created. So we should, if we scroll through here, find custom object. And I'm going to select our secret object and add that to our change set. And keep in mind, when you have different types of things you want to add, like an object and a flow, you can't just go to object, select the object, then hit the drop down to go to flow and select the flow, and then hit add the change set. You have to do them one at a time because it doesn't remember what you selected from one screen to the other, which is less than ideal, right? But in any case, if I go to flow definition, we're going to grab that. I think it was grant access to secret. There you go. So add that. So we have our object, we have our flow. Let's add in our lightning page, which I think should be under the aptly named lightning page. What do we call that one? I think that was grant something as well. Maybe not. Secret. There you go. Secret object request page. So add that. What else? We got the flow. We got the object. We have the page that we put it on. I think that's good enough for now. So in other words, you would go through, find all the things that you created or that you want to deploy, add them to your change set. Now, one other thing that I should mention here too is if you just added this to a change set and tried to deploy this to production, it'll deploy all the changes, but for your object, nobody's going to have access to it. And now that I remember that, let's add that permission set real quick. But if you were to, here, let's go to permission sets. Secret object access. Good. Okay, so if you were to deploy these changes to production, none of your profiles would have access to any of the objects you included here, or they won't have any field level security for any of the fields you created. So if you want to include those permissions and deploy those permissions along with the things you're deploying, that's what this bottom section is for, the profile settings. So if I wanted to deploy these changes and include the permissions for, maybe the key profiles for my org, I can do this. So I can go in here and I can say, I want to include all the access for the sysadmin that I've set, as well as for our, identity custom user, right? So when we deploy this, it's not going to deploy all the settings for these users or for these profiles. It's not going to include every permission in the system that they have. It's only including permissions for these profiles related to this stuff that's in your chain set, right? So that's a key thing to know. It's not deploying everything. It's just the access related to these items in the chain set itself, okay? So once we do that, once we add the items that we need, once we add the profiles and the access that we need to include with these items, that's when we can actually go ahead and click this upload link here. Now, when you try to upload this, it's going to ask you, where do you want to upload it to? And if you've never done this before, this is the screen that you might actually see. And it says, this organization isn't authorized to upload change sets to any other org. So in other words, you have to go to those other orgs and explicitly say, yes, I will accept changes from that sandbox before it's going to even allow you to upload the change set. So what I would have to do would be go into my production org, which I'm in here right now. And if we look under deployment, I think it's under deployment settings, you'll see here kind of a map of your environments and all the ones that are allowed to deploy changes. And you can see here, I have this one for office hour, and right now that's showing up in red. All right, so if I click edit here, we can change that, or we can allow inbound changes, and I can save that. Now, in theory, if we go back to our sandbox now, and I go back to that screen and I click the upload link again, we should now be allowed to upload this to production. All right, so there we go. So it's going to say, where do you want to deploy or upload this to? I can select production and then click upload. Now, key thing to remember here is that if you create a change set and you upload it to your production environment, even when the upload is complete, nothing has happened yet, right? All you've done is actually taken those changes, that kind of package or that change set, and you've put it into production to make it available, but it hasn't been deployed yet. No changes are actually made to your environment yet. It's just there ready to go. And when we say it's there and it's ready to go, what that means is if you go into your production environment and we go into our inbound permission sets this time, we should see that the one that we just created, and I'm having trouble typing today, sorry. So inbound change sets, we should see the one that just got created. And there we go, secret object changes v1. Now, keep in mind sometimes you might get that message from Salesforce to say, hey, your change set upload has been successful. So you go into your production environment, you go to click on this. Sometimes you might be presented with a message like, hey, this thing is still being processed and it's not available right now. Check back later, right? So all you gotta do is just wait a few minutes, hit refresh, and then it'll bring you back to this screen. Now, you notice that this looks very similar to what we had in the sandbox, right? You can see what components are part of this change set. You can see what profile settings will be included as part of the change set. But you don't have any of the other stuff like adding components or deleting components. It just gives you that kind of view-only view of the change set. And from here, you have a couple different things you can do. Well, one of them is, well, maybe you didn't intend to upload this thing or you don't need it anymore, so you just click delete, right? So that one's pretty self-explanatory. The other two options that you have are validate and deploy. Now, for a change set like this, where we don't have, there's not a lot of code, there's not a lot of Apex and things that we've included here, you might just say, okay, when you're ready for this, you're just going to deploy it, right? And just by clicking deploy, it'll go through all the steps, and when it's successful, it'll have applied those changes to your environment. The other option that you have, though, is the validation. So you can actually come in here, and if you were to click this validate, which I'll do here, you can say, okay, what tests do we want to run? In this case, we'll keep it simple, just run the default Apex tests and click validate. And you see, you get this message here that basically says it's going to simulate the deployment, and it's going to let you know if there's any kind of errors or if there's any kind of problems, or if it's successful, but it's not going to apply any changes to your actual environment. All right, so if I were to do this, I'm going to click OK. It'll go through, it'll validate. It'll actually, I can, if I click over here to the deployment status screen, You can see, all the components deploying. It turns into the deployment fish, which I have no idea how that's not been fixed after like all these years. But that circle kind of shows you the status of this thing. And then eventually, what you'd expect to see is if there's any kind of tests that need to run, they'll spin here as well. And eventually, you'll see a line that says succeeded, and it'll say validate succeeded, not deploy succeeded. Okay. So again, very quick, walkthrough of deploying a change set or creating a change set and then deploying that change set. Once again, I will stop my share and we can open up for questions. So any questions on either the permission or session-based permission sets or deploying change sets in your environments? Again, very quick example, but any thoughts or any questions there?
Bill, I have a question.
Sure.
Usually after something's deployed, you want to double check and test, right? I guess, what's your process to validate that everything's working as expected? Do you go through like a bunch of different scenarios or just like as one person? Or, well, I'm just curious what your best practice is there.
Yeah, great question. So I think it really depends on what it is that I'm changing, right? So if we created a whole bunch of fields and we're displaying them on layouts and I need to deploy that to production, I think the test is really just once the change set's deployed, we might go to that page, make sure we can see the fields, hit edit, make sure we can edit them, everything is looking okay. So I mean, the simpler changes, there's not a lot of testing that I would do, at least in my org, for those. But when we talk about deploying things like, for example, flows, right? If I were to deploy a flow, no matter how many times I read that it might be auto-activated when you deploy it, I go to that flow and I make sure that it's set as active, right? Or maybe I go and I make sure it's inactive, whatever it is, but I want to make sure I confirm the status of those. And I might do the same thing for things like triggers, right? If I deploy that, I want to make sure that it's set as active in the environment. And then from there, again, I think it's really use case specific, but if you're deploying like a record triggered flow, you definitely want to go through and make sure that you cover all the key data points that are going to be triggering that flow. Make sure it executes when you expect it to, make sure it doesn't execute when you don't expect it to. If it's doing some kind of calculation, validating that the numbers are coming out correctly. So things like that. So again, I think it's, whether you deploy things via change set, whether you're installing them as part of a managed package, you're deploying it via VS Code or the metadata API. I think no matter how you're deploying your changes, it still comes down to what is the thing that we're deploying, and then what are the specific test cases that we've outlined to test those things. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, but usually it depends on what's in the package. Again, if it's flows and triggers, I check to make sure they're activated. If it's some kind of business logic, I make sure that I test the logic itself to make sure it's doing things correctly. As part of the deployment, it already validates that all your Apex tests are running correctly. So you don't really have to do that manually. Yeah, so I think it really just comes down to that, knowing what you're deploying and kind of having a plan already in place for how you're going to test it.
That helps. Thank you. And then is there, like, I know in Flow you can kind of revert back to a different version if it's not quite right. But in terms of permission sets or permission changes, is there like some kind of safety thing that you can go back to what it was before? Or like, is there something you should do beforehand to make sure you have what it was versus after the changes in case something happens where it's messed up after a change set?
Yeah, great question. So I think for the most part, when we talk about things like flows and process builder, Salesforce has great mechanisms in place where you can see the previous version of those things. And if you ever had to revert back, you can just deactivate the current version and reactivate the previous version. That doesn't apply for everything in Salesforce. So when we talk about like changes to the page layout or changes to your profile permissions, things like that, Salesforce, at least to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong if anybody knows otherwise, but at least right now, out of the box, you don't have an automated way of reverting your changes back to what was there before. Now, I said automated way of reverting your changes back. There's all kinds of ways you can do that manually, right? So for me, because I have a very small organization with a very small number of people that are actually working in Salesforce, together, I keep it very simple. Anytime we make any changes to code or page layouts or even flows, I do this for, even though they have the mechanism there. What I'll do is I'll go into VS Code, I'll just connect to the org and download those things. And we have a GitHub repository that I check it into, right? So, Git is one way of doing it, downloading the changes and checking them in. So you have that kind of full history there. But there's all kinds of other tools that you can do that you can look at as well. A couple of months ago, we had Own Backup on the call. And they kind of walk through ways in which you can back up certain types of metadata with their tool. And there's all kinds of apps on the App Exchange, like continuous integration, continuous development type apps, who are geared around monitoring changes to metadata. So all kinds of tools that can help you with that. But for me, again, I just keep it simple. VS Code, download the changes, check it in the Git. I mean, I think it's simple because I do that for all my other code for development stuff. But again, that's one way. It's a free way, which is always nice too. So that's the route that we go. But anybody else have any thoughts about ways to keep track of history of various pieces of metadata as you're deploying changes in your environments?
Well, I had a question as it related to a user case, just viewing it from a user case lens. When designing a change set, is there a way to track and I guess limit the time amount that someone would have access to that permission set where they normally wouldn't need it for a long period of time? And if so, what is that time period and how do we control it as sales administrators so that it is monitored and security is kept on those permission sets?
So let me say that back to you so I understand it. So in the context of session-based permission sets, you want to know how can you build controls in to say essentially when people are allowed to use that, and for what reasons and things like that, like building in that. Yeah, absolutely. So that's one thing that I mentioned, that that flow that we created, super simple, right? It was just basically you click OK and it applies that permission set to you. But you could build in logic there to say, okay, people can only enable this between the hours of 5 p.m. and 2 a.m. right? So you could build that into your flow. You could build audit mechanisms into it. So imagine you had a permission set request form object that you create that has the user, the time that they're requesting it, and then you make them in that screen flow put in a reason why they are requesting that permission set, right? So they can go in, they actually have to fill in the form, and then when they hit OK, it logs that into the audit table and then grants them the permission. Now, I'm going to give you an in theory because I've never tested this, but I can see how in theory you probably can architect a solution in such a way that when they request permission to a permission set, that you put that on a table with a record triggered flow that after 10 minutes, it automatically takes the permission away. You can even do stuff like that, right? And you can imagine how you can get this into, you could really build on this, where if you had 10 session-based permission sets that you're trying to manage, you could build that as a single screen where the first screen is, what permission do you need? And that takes you to the next thing that says, why do you need it? And then when they hit OK, it grants them the permission and then lands them on another screen that says, you have this permission now for the next 10 minutes, hurry up and do what you want to do, right? So yeah, there's all kinds of ways you can expand on that process, including things like enforcing the time of day, or I even believe there's ways to do it based on IP addresses, all kinds of things you can build around this. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Any other questions or any other thoughts? I know, so as far as, I think we still have an open question. Any other methods that folks use for monitoring metadata changes in their orgs besides VS Code to Git, like I mentioned, or tools like Own Backup, or these other kind of App Exchange partners?
I was going to say, Bill, I would like to see maybe one day as a topic to further explore the whole idea of using Git to and the functions that are available in VS Code to synchronize those and stuff. I think that would be a valuable thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can schedule an entire session on that. I mean, what I can do real quick I can actually give you a quick view of what that actually looks like. So let me open VS Code. Let me hide all of my secret squirrel stuff so it doesn't go up on YouTube. But yeah, I can show you just very quickly what I mean by pulling the metadata down from VS Code, and then I think we can schedule a deep dive to go through this in detail. But if I go to, let's see here. All right, so let me close all of my code. Let's hide this. Okay, so let me share my screen. So this is VS Code. Right now I have no files open, nothing's going on here, right? So let's just say that starting from scratch, I want to be able to connect to my production org and then back up some classes or back up some code that I have in that org. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our the keyboard command Control-Shift-P from within VS Code. Let me try that again. And I'm going to say I'm going to create a project. All right, I'm going to call this project something like production backup. All right, and I don't think I can see it because I got this thing in front of it. Let me try that again. So we're going to do create project. We're going to wait because apparently everything is slow right now. Any second now. Okay, I think my VS Code is still booting up. That's why nothing is happening. So down here in this this section here, you'll see some other stuff will pop up here, letting you know the VS Code is fully loaded. I don't know why it's taking so long, but we'll give that a second. But in any case, just a very high level, we would create a project within VS Code. And when we say create a project, it's literally just an empty folder structure that has nothing in it. We then connect to production through our tools we have here. You can connect to any org you want, even a sandbox, but what we would connect to production. And then it'll enable a little icon over here, the org browser. So when you click on that, you can see every piece of metadata that's in your environment and then be able to click on it and download it if you so choose. But for whatever reason, I don't know why this is taking so long, but let me just stop my share and see if that helps. But yeah, VS Code doesn't want to cooperate right now. So yeah, let me see if I can do it one more time. Okay, finally, it's activating. Okay, bear with me here. We'll try this again. Maybe any second now. Okay, I'll tell you what. If this pops up, we'll jump into that. I don't know why it's not cooperating right now, but I can definitely schedule a session where we'll call it almost like VS Code for admins. So even if you weren't writing code, what are all the cool things you can do in VS Code to, back up your metadata, work with Git to, store your changes, over time, and all those kind of things. So yeah, and even deploying changes. So if we don't want to do change sets and you wanted to deploy your changes to VS Code, you can even do that. So we can walk through that. And okay, and I'll tell you what, since it finally showed up here, let me just show you what I was talking about. So VS Code, Control-Shift-P, create project. We're going to do a standard project called prod backup. Okay, now it's going to ask me where I want to put it. So any second now. We'll put this in somewhere over here. We'll call this in and put in our ISV work. That's my main production org folder. All right, so there we go. Now what I'm going to do is, now that we have this project created, and if I look at our folder structure here, that is not our new project. So again, it's still creating my project. So it's refreshing. There we go. So the project is created. And now when we look in our folder, there's just going to be a bunch of empty metadata folders, right? So there's nothing in here right now. So what I can do, I can now connect this to my production org, which again is taking a long time, but you'll see it's activating. And then I should get a thing here where I can select my default org. I should get a thing here where I can select my default org any second here. Yeah, I don't know why it's taking so long. Any minute here. Okay, yeah. So maybe I do need to schedule a time and go through this and also figure out why this is taking so long in my share right now. I'm usually very snappy, to be honest with you, but I don't know why it's being difficult today. But yeah, so in any case, once we were able to connect to that org, we would get that org browser over here, and there we go. So let's do this. So in my case, my production org is called DevHub, and if I go to as soon as I click that, you should see DevHub pop up right here. as the name. Now that I've set that as my default. And as soon as that happens, you'll see a little cloud icon pops up right here. And there you go. So I can click on Org Browser now. So when you do this, now that this is connected to my production org, every little bit of metadata in my production org is available here. So page layouts, objects, fields, visual force pages, Apex code, whatever you have in production, it's going to be available through this interface. So for example, if I wanted to go here and go to our objects, and I want to download every bit of information, metadata about my account object, I can click download. You'll see the process runs here in the bottom right that it's downloading. And if I go back to my folders now and I expand this and I go under objects, you can now see that I have my account object and I can see every field. And for a given field, if I wanted to see the details about that field, I can click on that and you can see, the type of field, how many characters it is, all that stuff. Now, if you wanted to make sure that, okay, this is my baseline and now I'm about to make a bunch of changes, you would be able to check this in the Git. And I'm not even going to go into that right now because that's a whole topic in and of itself. But you could take this whole folder as it exists right now, check it into a Git repository, and then as you make changes, it'll actually point out what changes have you made. So yeah, a lot of cool things you can do with VS Code as an admin. And like I said, maybe we'll schedule a session just to go through that.
Bill, so where was that data stored? Or, it said output. So if you want to look at it and evaluate it, I mean, is it available for to upload in Excel or?
Are you talking about the what we downloaded from production, like that account data?
Yes.
Yeah. Now keep in mind, it's not account data. I misspoke when I said that. This is account metadata. So we're not downloading records. We're not downloading, Acme Corporation or anything like that. What we're downloading is the actual definition of the account object. So what is the object? What are the fields in that object? What are the page layouts available for that object? The list views, all that kind of stuff. That's what we actually downloaded. So it's typically not something you're going to open up in Excel like you would a list of records. This is, XML files and other types of metadata or other type of configuration type information about the account object. So that's what we've actually downloaded here.
Well, the reason I ask is because I use Excel to search for everything. So I would load it in. I mean, but that's what I'm trying to understand where this data is. I know it says output there. But
yeah. So this output that you see here, this is just a list of the metadata that we've downloaded. So, or in other words, the information about the account object that we've downloaded. So it just puts that into the output here. It's like a command line output that just shows you everything that happened. But the actual metadata itself, when I created this project, when I did that Control-Shift-P, it did create project, and we gave it a name, and then it's going to ask you where you want to put it. So you actually specify what folder you want this project to live in, and that's where you would find all this information. So for example, if I were to go to, I should be able to right click on this folder, just say this one here, and do reveal in File Explorer. You can see, so I have a folder called ISV work, and that's where we put this folder. So if I go in there, you can see that, Force app, main default, and then everything that we've downloaded about our org is going to show up here. So in our case, we did objects and then account, and then there's all those files.
And let me share with you my another question is why I'm asking about all this. So in Salesforce, you activate email to Salesforce, and in there is a field in which you can enter an email address to be used, and you can also enter multiple email addresses. So the question was given to me, is there a way, instead of going into each screen and putting an email address for each user, is there a way to do it in more than one way? Of course, I immediately say, oh yeah, we could export the data and get your emails formatted and load the data. Well, no one knows the object where that email address, the object or the field that email addresses are loaded. So I'm trying to find out, where do we get this object?
What so when you say email to Salesforce, where in setup would I find that? Let's take a look at that real quick.
When you go into settings, your personal.
Oh, you're talking about the email address of the user themselves.
Well, but it's for email to Salesforce. It's not just the user email address. Because I've
Okay.
come to find out there's email addresses all over the place here in Salesforce.
Okay, now I got to
So-
remember to comment or to cut this part of the video out where you can't see my phone number and everything else. So if anybody wants to call me, I don't answer anyway. So my wife will tell you that.
So
Yep.
click on email.
Okay. Email. Yep.
Okay.
Email to Salesforce.
And that failed my acceptable email addresses.
Okay.
And there can be multiple in there. But
Yeah.
we're just,
Yeah. So this is a user thing. So my acceptable email addresses. Interesting. All right. Short answer is I have no idea. But let me just take a quick look here.
well, I've been taking the approach. Okay, how can I unload all the objects and find out their fields? And there's one way to make a metadata report, but and that's where I stopped last night. I don't know, it was early AM, and I'm like, I need to pick this up today.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking there's got to be somewhere. I don't know if this is one of those things that Salesforce doesn't make available, but if I just look at the user table, for example, we have the email preferences, we have the actual email field, sender email.
Which I'm sure when you opened up that screen, as default, it took that user email address that was defined in the user setup. But
yeah, I wonder if I just test. I wonder if I just put something in here and save that, and then come back in here. Let's just scan through here. User preferences, anything email, content email as and when, content email. Yeah, I'm going to go through here and see if anything jumps out at me as as that. But let me just open up. Anybody know or have worked with this before that they know where to find this? Okay, so I'm going to actually.
I will say, I certainly don't know the answer to this question, but I have discovered that in Data Loader, there is an option you can turn on to see all of the objects. And I know this because I'm working in commerce, and a lot of the tables that are or the objects that are in commerce are not available typically. But if you check that box and say show all tables or all objects,
Yep.
you can get to see more than you would normally see.
thank you. I appreciate that. I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking that this thing is available here, but I just don't know. I mean, there's a ton of user fields here, and I'm thinking one of them has to be that thing. But yeah, maybe what I can do is take this one as homework, and if we can figure out exactly what field that might be storing to, that might be helpful. So, I mean, you can see here. You know what? Let me try to do a search on this page. So here, let's close this. So if I search this and we look for the email, okay, so there's only 100 of them. So if we scan through real quick, email, comments, disable, nope. Disable, nope. Receive info emails, email encoding, nope.
Well, I'm at the point
Yeah.
where I'm going to change the addresses, then see if I can find them in the database somewhere, and then I'll definitely use that metadata export switch or reporting switch, whatever it is. And but yeah, I thought this would be so simple, but
Yeah, I think if it was you updating the user email addresses, that would be somewhat simple. You can just export the user table up, re-upload with the updated email addresses. This is a little bit different. I think this is one of those kind of weird places in Salesforce that it might be a setting that maybe they just haven't exposed through the API essentially. But let me just see if I just do a star email here. What other tables are in here for email? So contact, Apex, email capture, content, service address, maybe. So let's look at that one. So if we query this, ooh, that's promising. Yeah, I think this is it. Yeah, because there's that test address that I put in here. So in theory, if I change that to squirrel at resourceheroapp.com and then come back in this table and refresh. Yeah, there you go. So the table that you're looking for that you would actually have to export is the email services address table.
Give me a second. I'm gonna do a snapshot here.
There, let me make it. Yeah, that should do it. Yeah, it looks like whatever you put in that table, that's what shows up here. Now, just as a quick test, let me know when you're done snapshotting, and then I'll jump over here.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, so if I go in here and I put a comma, you mentioned about multiple addresses, tester at rha.com, and I save that. What I would expect is that that's going to create 2 lines in this table. So if I refresh, maybe not. Okay, so it's just 1. Yeah, so if you had multiple addresses, you would put them all in that single column. Now, what I don't know here, and this is something that you have to test, is can you have a CSV file of some sort and actually upload to that table? That's a whole nother thing. So accessing it through Developer Console and being able to query it versus making that table accessible through Data Loader or whatever other tool that you're using to upload, I'm not really sure. So you'd have to test that, and maybe you can report back.
Yeah. No, but this is a big help, everyone. Thank you for all this key information. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, cool. Any other questions then? We have about 10 minutes left, but any other topics anybody wants to discuss or questions that you have? All right. Well, like I said, I'll stay on here for a few more minutes, but otherwise, I appreciate everybody joining, and thank you all for your time. And we'll connect next week. And I think next week's topic is going to be around, as a Salesforce administrator, the benefits of using VS Code. So VS Code for Salesforce admins. I think that's next week's topic. So thank you all. And if you need to drop off, great. And have a great weekend, and we'll catch up next week.
Hey, Bill.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
This is in reference to permission sets.
Sure. Yeah.
So how can I grant a user view only permissions to reports?
View only permission to reports. Okay. So I wanna
All
share my-
objects.
Yeah. So in other words, you want them to be able to run reports, and you want them to have just view access to whatever key tables that they need to run those reports on.
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing is that whatever profile that you put them in, you want to make sure that it's locked down. So the Salesforce has that profile in here here, let me get out of this and I'll show you. Salesforce has an out-of-the-box profile with absolutely no permissions called, I think it's Salesforce minimum access. So I would say put them in a profile like that doesn't give them any other permissions, no read access, no edit access, nothing. And then when you create your permission set, what we would do is create a minimum access permission, or a reporting, on key objects permission set. What am I doing here? Let me go back here. Permission sets, new permission set. There we go. And we're going to call this key object reporting. Okay. So key object reporting, we'll keep the license blank. We'll just click save here. So the first thing that you'd want to enable in this permission set is the ability to run reports, right? So if we don't know where to find that, I can just come up here and type in report, and I should get a list of the permissions that run reporting. So I should be able to select run reports, and that'll take me. And this is one of the more annoying things with the UI, but it'll take you to the actual permission, and that run reports is probably halfway down the page. And then you actually have to hit edit and then re-scroll down the page. But here you go. Yeah, so it drops you all the way down here, and then you have to go all the way back up here, click edit, and then come all the way back down there and try to find that run reports, which thankfully this is alphabetized. Sorry, alphabet's hard. There we go. Run reports. Okay, so we select run reports. And then if you wanted to make it so they can run reports on the account object and the opportunity object, that's where we would actually go in here and start, granting access to the various objects, right? So I would change this to object settings, and we would grant read access to the appropriate object. So let's just say accounts. I want to say that this permission set is going to have access to run reports on accounts. They're going to have access to run reports, and now we're going to say that they can see the account object. So we're going to select read on here, assuming again that this cooperates. Any second now. Any second now. Okay, there we go. So we'll give them read access, and then you can even specify what fields you want them to be able to run reports on, right? So let's just say that you wanted, all the required fields or the kind of key fields, they're already selected by default. But let's just say you also want them to get, read access to description and industry. That's the only fields you want them to report on. So we would select that and click save. So now if you had somebody in that minimum access Salesforce profile and you were to grant them access to this permission set, they would be able to run reports, and they would be able to run reports on the account object. And the only fields that they would see are the ones you've selected here. So taking a quick step back, does that answer your question, or as to what you were trying to do?
Well, they have a yes, and they have a profile where they do have access to a particular division. They don't have access to all of the divisions.
Okay, so this is more of, they have access to, for example, the account object, but they might not have access to all of the records in that object because they sit over here in the hierarchy, for example, and they need access to everybody's.
Yes, that's
okay.
correct.
Is it a specific set of users that you want to grant access to, like 2 or 3?
Just one.
Okay, so one way that you could accomplish that, so essentially you want to give them access to all accounts, to be able to read access to all accounts so that they can run reports and view the account. Okay, so what I might suggest would be create a public group called whatever you call it, the person's position, their name, whatever you want to call that public group. You put them in the public group, and then what you would be able to do is create a sharing rule. For example, if I go to sharing settings, and let's see, I hope I get this one right, because I have actually scheduled my visibility and sharing architect test. So if I get this one wrong, I'm gonna feel real bad. In any case, if I go here and I go to accounts, once you create that public group where you put that user in there, you would be able to come into your sharing settings page, select account, and if you scroll down, you'll see account sharing rules. And then what we should be able to do is, based on whose data you want to share, you would be able to say share here. Let's see, and let's share all of the accounts for the role and subordinates of, I don't know, let's just say CEO or whatever that top level role that you have is, and you want to share that with the public group, whatever one you create, Jim Smith or this guy, right? And then you would select the default access as read only for the account.
Oh, okay.
So if you
That
create
makes sense.
create the public group, put that user in the group, then create that sharing rule that says take all the accounts and share that with that person. Now, another way you could do it, and again, there's different ways you can do this, but you could, in theory, create a permission set called access all accounts. Here, I'll actually do this here too. If I were to go to permission sets, and let's just say that one user is going to need, view access to all accounts. I can create, and I'm doing this in Sandbox. I was going to say I'm going to have a whole bunch of junk to clean up later. Access all accounts. Okay, and let's actually call that view all accounts. Oh my God, let's try that again. Okay, view all accounts and save. And then in our permissions here, we should be able to go to object settings. And then at the very bottom, or I'm sorry, under object permissions, if we go to the account object, one of the permissions that we should have access here is view all. So let's see. So if we edit this now, we can grant any second now. In post-production, I'm gonna have to cut out all these delays just so it looks a little bit more performant here. Okay, there we go. So we can select view all. Okay, and save. And then you would apply this permission set to that one user that requires the ability to see every account in the database.
And then if they needed to see every contact, do the same
Yeah, I
thing.
mean, if it's
Okay.
a maybe the position that this person holds is called the global report runner, and they need read access to accounts, contacts, and every account, every contact, and every opportunity,
Mhm.
and they're the only person that's ever going to need that. This could be
Mhm.
one way to do it. So you would basically go in there, and for the account object, for the contacts and opportunities, just set that view all permission, and then grant this one permission set to that one user that requires the access.
Okay.
I
Thank
would
you
say
so
this is
much,
probably
Bill.
between the two options, I would think that this might be the better option. If you wanted them to have access to all accounts in like the Western Division, for example, that might be where the sharing rule might be a better way to go with a group and a sharing rule. But if it's that person needs access to everything, there's no exceptions, they need access to every single account, this would be one way to do it. Just grant that view all.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, cool. So I think just about 1 o'clock. So I'll once again say thank you to everybody who joined today, and hope you can catch us next week.